on a mandatory basis exempt from the purpose of consolidation, and investment entity would not consolidate, measure all its subsidiaries, what we say at FVTPL. But in this particular video, what we're going to talk of is how do we identify that whether it is an investment entity or not. Because once the parent identifies that as an investor, it is an investment entity, it gets an exemption from consolidation. Let's find this out in this video. अनअकैडमी पर संडे के संडे एक कंपटीशन होता है और इस संडे भी आपको एक कंपटीशन मिलेगा, कम्बैक्ट कंपटीशन। इंटरमीडिएट के जो बच्चे इसके अंदर पार्टिसिपेट कर सकते हैं और आपने करना क्या है, एक बेसिकली ऐप डाउनलोड करनी है और उसके बाद आपने संडे को 12 बजे एक लाइव टेस्ट देना है जिनमें 40 क्वेश्चंस आपसे पूछे जाएंगे इन 60 मिनट्स, जो आपके कोर्स के बेसिस पर क्वेश्चंस पूछे जाएंगे। और इस पर जब आपकी रैंक्स आएंगी तो इसके बेसिस पर आपको मिलेंगे बहुत सारे इनाम। टॉप 3 रैंकर्स को पूरे 1 साल की इंटरमीडिएट की सब्सक्रिप्शन एब्सोल्युटली स्कॉलरशिप के नाम पर फ्री दी जाएगी। जिनकी रैंक आएंगी रैंक नंबर 4 to 10, उन्हें 75% ऑफ दी सब्सक्रिप्शन स्कॉलरशिप के फॉर्म में मिलेगी। यही नहीं, जिनकी रैंक 11 to 50 आएंगी उन्हें 50% स्कॉलरशिप मिलेगी। और यही नहीं, जिनकी रैंक 51 से लेकर 200 आएंगी उन्हें भी 25% ऑफ दी स्कॉलरशिप आपको मिलेगी। तो करना क्या है, आपने बड़ा सिंपल सा काम है, ऐप डाउनलोड करनी है और उसके बाद इस डिस्क्रिप्शन बॉक्स में एक लिंक दिया है और उसके बेसिस पर संडे को 12 बजे तैयार रहिए एक लाइव टेस्ट देने के लिए, रैंक्स अचीव कीजिए और खूब सारे इनाम जीतिए, क्योंकि इसके अंदर जो पूल है वो 1 करोड़ का पूल है। तो आइए, लेट्स क्रैक इट। Well, you can see a very interesting equation which is there in terms of investment entity. One is there are 3 definition parameters. Now, along with the definition parameters, what I've done, I've also written something which is called an exit strategy. The exit strategy is not a part of the definition parameters. I put them as an extra. You need to have an exit strategy as well. Now, apart from the 3 parameters given in the definition of investment entity, you also need to meet what we call the 4 typical characteristics of an investment entity. So I would say indirectly, there are a total of 8 conditions, or you can say 8 parameters which need to be met before we call it as an investment entity. Now, one thing is pretty sure that out of all these 8 parameters, the 3 definition parameters is something which has to be met. Exit strategy is something which may or may not met. We're going to talk of the exit strategy in the next video. And as far as the 4 typical characteristics is concerned, that is something again which requires a judgment. I put a note as well. I'm talking of the 4 typical characteristics, not the definition parameters. Even if you miss out meeting any of the typical characteristics, it does not mean that it is not an investment entity. So there could be possibilities that you fail certain typical characteristics, but still it becomes an investment entity. But of course, meeting the definition parameters is of course important. Now let's have a little quick look in terms of what the definition parameters are, what is an exit strategy, and what are those 4 typical characteristics before we call an entity to be an investment entity. In terms of the definition parameters, you need to put across a first question: what does the entity do? It must be typically providing investment management services. And the second is, we need to see that what is the objective of this investment entity, getting a capital appreciation from the investments, or maybe getting an interest or dividend income from the investments, or both. The third parameter is in terms of that these investments are being measured at a fair value. And as we said that there is an exit strategy, the exit strategy would mean that if an investment entity is investing in, let's say, debt securities or equity securities, or let's say, for example, any non-financial assets, it must have an exit plan that it is going to come out of those investments. That is something very, very important, because if they're planning to hold these investments for an indefinite period of time, it would fail to meet the parameters of an investment entity. And if you look at the 4 typical characteristics, they're pretty simple and straight. You should generally, I'm using the word very carefully, you should generally have more than one investors. You should have generally more than one investments. I'm using the word generally because there can be exceptions. You may have a single investment, you may have a single investor, but still it turns out to be an investment entity. The entity and the investors have to be unrelated parties generally, but there could be cases where they are related and still it becomes an investment entity. And these investment entities should have issued securities, and generally the securities would be, sometimes in the form of units which they might have issued to the investors. Something like what we call the units of mutual fund, but I'm not making a reference to that, but I'm saying something that they've issued units as a part of their own structure. So to put it again, we can say 3 definition parameters you need to meet. Exit strategy, maybe yes or no. And the 4 typical characteristics you may or may not meet, but it does not necessarily mean that if they're met, it's an investment entity, and if they're not met, it's not an investment entity. Requires a careful judgment of the facts and circumstances. Isn't that pretty interesting? That's all in this video. Thank you, take care, and goodbye.